Okay. Hello. Hi. How's it going? I hope this finds you well. Oh my gosh, it's December already. That means that the round two deadlines are about a month away. So maybe you started this process 3 weeks ago. Maybe you started 6 months ago. Maybe you started 36 months ago. And if you're anything like me, when you started, you were like, whatever, January. It's like, I've got so much time. And now here we are. We're about a month away from the round two deadlines. So we are down to the wire. Things are going to start picking up. If you haven't already put the pedal to the metal on your application, I urge you to get started on that like today. And so what we are going to do today is we are going to cover, we've just sort of done open questions. We're going to take open questions for your last minute questions as you start to prepare your round two application. In case there aren't a lot of questions coming in, I also have some PowerPoint slides ready because who doesn't love PowerPoint? I'm being facetious. PowerPoint's terrible, but I do have some anyway. So that having been said, in case you don't know who I am, hi. My name is Maria Wich-Vila. I am the founder of ApplicantLab.com. I'm a 2005 graduate of Harvard Business School. And when I was at HBS, long story short, I realized that a lot of people needed help getting into business school, but not a whole lot of people could afford it. And so, as opposed to the traditional admissions consultants that charge $5,000, $8,000, $15,000 or more, I created ApplicantLab.com. And what ApplicantLab.com is it's a step-by-step DIY online platform that basically consists of all of my best advice. I am now in my 18th year. I'm so old. I'm now in my 18th year of giving admissions advice. And Applicant Lab distills it. So it's as if though I were sitting next to you. But since I'm not sitting next to you, I can charge you a lot less. And so Applicant Lab costs $350, which is less than what 1 hour of someone else with my caliber of experience and expertise would charge. So you can either pay for 1 hour with somebody else, or you can get everything you need at ApplicantLab.com, essays, resumes, interview, recommendation, advice, all of it. I've got it in there. So please do check it out if you haven't already, especially if you're in a hurry. If you waited until the last minute, even if you wanted to hire traditional admissions consultants, all the good ones have been booked for months. So even if you were to try to go out and hire someone right now, there would not be anyone, either no one's available or anyone who is available is probably, frankly, not that good. Sorry, but it's true. And so ApplicantLab.com, check it out. I've got a lot of in a hurry tips as you go through. So if you did procrastinate just a little bit, no problem. I've got you covered. I have little in a hurry tips as you go through so that you don't have to go through all of it. But if you are a very thorough person, I also have very in-depth explanations for those of you who like to understand why I tell you to do what I tell you to do. So with that introduction out of the way, we have collected some questions in advance from the audience. And I think we will also be taking questions as we go. If we end up getting a lot of questions, I will choose the questions that are most likely to be of most interest or benefit to the most number of people. So if you're like, oh, I'm left-handed and I'm 5'2", and so what are my chances? Like, if you don't ask a question that's super specific to you, it's just less likely to get answered because I want this to be as useful as possible for everyone. So let us pull up our first question. Let's see. I think, here we go. Oh, it's like covering my face. Look like I'm like sneaking around. Okay, so Cornell, short-term and long-term goals. My long-term goal is to go into private equity. Your short-term goal has to be IB, as PE does not directly recruit. That's right. Good job on doing your homework on that career path. So my whole pitch is that IB is my goal as means to an end. Your thoughts about it. So honestly, I think that has to be your pitch. Because as you yourself pointed out, if you apply to business school and you say, well, I want to go into private equity and I have, how much experience do I have? I have 0 experience, but I'm going to go directly into private equity after business school. So let me in. Thank you. The problem is that they are going to look at that and they're going to say, there is no way ever that you are going to get into a private equity job directly from business school with no relevant previous experience. Therefore, we can't help you achieve that goal. And then they start to get a little bit nervous of like, okay, so if we let this person in and then they don't get a private equity job, which they're probably not going to get, are they going to be mad at us? Are they going to blame us? Are they going to go on the forums and say, oh, this career service, they're terrible career services at that school and you shouldn't go. Right. So they just want to avoid the aggravation and the disappointment. And they don't want you to graduate at the end with 180,000 US dollars of debt saying, where's my private equity job? I thought that's what I was going to get. So yes, applying with investment banking first as your post MBA goal is what you have to do if in fact private equity is the final goal that you are going to apply with, because it shows that you've done your homework. It shows that it's realistic. One thing I would challenge you though is if you have zero finance experience whatsoever, just make sure that you have a really good story around what is it about private equity that interests you, right? A lot of jobs like private equity, hedge funds, management consulting, what have you, they're famous to MBA applicants because primarily they pay really well, right? But a lot of people don't really, beyond that, a lot of people don't really dig deep and they don't really say, well, what's the difference? I get a kick out of whenever I hear people lump VC and PE together. Like, yeah, I want to work in like venture capital or private equity. And it's like, they're similar, but you're looking at completely different deal flow. You're looking at a completely different process. You know what I mean? Like those are two very different things. So if you go into the admissions process and you say, well, I want to do VC PE, yeah, those things are lumped together because they get sort of the same, the capital comes from like limited partners and private, wealthy individuals, what have you, but they're kind of different. So anyway, where I'm going with this is you don't have just saying like, well, my short-term goal is IB because I want to do PE. Perfect. But my bigger question to you is that it's a rhetorical question is why do you want to do PE to begin with? If you have no experience in finance, how do you know that this is the spot in finance, that vast, enormous industry that is the finance industry? How do you know that that's where you want to play? And so I would make sure that you not only have that short-term goal well, but that you also explain what it is about, like why private equity, what research have you done that this is what you want to do? What is it about it that appeals to you? So make sure that whole story is tight, not just the what you plan to do, but why you plan to do it, why it interests you. All right. Next question. I've got my mug. See, it's fine. It's fine. We've got a month left until the deadlines, but everything is fine. Okay. My question relates to Cornell's. How has your experience prepared and encouraged you to question? Should we address the immediate short-term goal or the long-term goal, which I am aspiring to pursue? So I think it should be honestly, it should be a little bit of both insofar as your short-term goal and your long-term goal should be linked. They should be somewhat related, right? So what I would also make sure that you make it clear, and this kind of carries over from what I was saying a second ago, make it clear also what research you've done about why the MBA is that path. Like when it says, how has your experience prepared and encouraged you to, let's say, go for an MBA, you need to talk about like, well, here's why I'm ready to get an MBA right now. Here are the skills and the experiences that I have amassed so far over the course of my career. And also here's why Cornell is where I want to go. So I think if I'm getting your question correct, I think it would all kind of link together, right? And so I think the onus on you is not so much to talk about, I think it would be talking about what elements of your background make you a good MBA candidate. In other words, if all you've done is just sat at a computer by yourself your entire career and never talked to another human being, that's probably not a good thing to talk about. But if you have led teams, and that is something that relates to your future goals, then that would be a good thing to talk about, right? So you can say, well, my experience so far, I've been preparing because I was leading a product team last year and it opened my eyes as to, where it is that I want to go next. I think also, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head, and I am answering this question off the top of my head, I think that might also be a place where you can mention where you've spoken to Cornell students. I would have to quickly dig up to refresh my memory. But that could also be another thing in terms of just saying, like, look, I've spoken to the following 3 Cornell students. I mean, Cornell really wants to see that you have reached out to their students. Some schools don't care. Harvard, Stanford do not care. Other schools are sort of like meh about it, but a school like Cornell really, really cares about you doing that. So anyone applying to Cornell who might be watching this, especially if you are applying to a Cornell, please do reach out to some students right now, current students, admissions ambassadors, students who are in the clubs that you're, for the previous question, the investment banking or finance club. Please reach out to those people now so that you can drop their names in your application, because it shows that you've put forth the effort. It's not just for the sake of being able to drop in a name. It's more like it shows that, like, okay, I actually care about your school. I really am really interested in your school, and look at this extra effort I put in to get to know you. What is your opinion on EA scores versus GMAT and GRE? What types of scores do you think applicants should be targeting to be competitive? So I think, first of all, the biggest downside of the EA is that a lot of full-time programs do not accept it. So for those of you who are new, by the way, in case you're sort of like just joining us, EA stands for the executive assessment. It's essentially the GMAT light. It's a much shorter version of the GMAT. Whether or not it's easier, I'm not sure, but the mere fact that it doesn't take hours and hours of your life to take the test is hopefully some indicator that it's easier on some level. So the executive assessment was originally developed for executive MBA applicants, right? People in their 30s and 40s who might be going back to school, who honestly do not have the time to study for a test, but they still need to show that they're capable of handling the work. So the GMAT created the EA as sort of like a GMAT light for those people. So where we are today is that some of the full-time programs have said, well, wait a minute, maybe we should accept the EA in addition to the regular GMAT and GRE. So number one, not a lot of schools yet are allowing for the EA, because the minute any school does, I think you're going to see a bit of a stampede towards the EA if a majority of schools begin accepting it, right? And then no one will take the GMAT anymore, and then it's kind of that's not a great outcome, I don't think. So, but there are some schools that do accept the EA for full-time programs, not simply for the executive programs. So I think if you are only applying to schools that accept the EA, I go for it. Why wouldn't you make things as easy on yourself as possible? You should absolutely apply with the EA instead. It's easier, it's shorter. And then the other benefit too of applying with an EA score is that as of right now, the MBA ranking journalists, I don't think some of the people who work at MBA rankings are actual journalists, but some of the people who put together things like, top 10 business schools, those lists, they often look at average GMAT score for the class as one of the main, if not the main stat that they look at to judge the schools, right? So when a school is 2 years earlier, when they are starting to look at applicants and they're looking at the GMAT scores that are coming in, something that it's not the number one thing that they are looking at, but it's certainly in the back of their minds is like, okay, so if we let in all these people with like a 680, that means our average is going to go down. And we don't want that, because if our average goes down, then our ranking will go down. And then a whole bunch of bad things kind of avalanche from there. So where I'm going with this is that the EA, since the EA is not currently part of what is involved in the rankings, not only is it easier to take, but it's safer from a school's perspective. In other words, if I let in someone with a low GMAT score, I know that that person is, even in a small way, going to drag down my school's average. But if I let someone in with a low EA score, no one's going to really know, because it's not going to be as trumpeted, right? Because every year when the schools publish their average GMAT score for the entering class, it's a very big hullabaloo, but no one's going to make the same big deal over the EA score. So take the EA also just for the mere purpose that it's not going to matter as much if you, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I'm just saying from the school's perspective, they would be more willing to take a chance on someone with a lower EA score versus a lower GMAT score. In terms of what makes for a good score, it's interesting. It is such a pretty new-ish test in terms of the test itself is not new, but in terms of being used for full-time MBA admissions. I think the rule of thumb is that you want at least a 160. Like a 160 is a good score, but I think anything like in the mid 150s, my understanding is that that's a good score. I will caveat this with, I am not a test prep person. You may want to direct your question to someone who is on the test prep side of this ecosystem. But off the top of my head, I think 155, 160 plus is what you should be aiming for. While shortlisting MBA schools, how much emphasis should be given to the sector-wise employment report? Are there any factors which can be more important, especially for an international applicant? So this is, it's almost like I fed you this question. I love this question because I don't think this is something that enough applicants pay enough attention to early on. And then they get to a school and they're like, oh, wait a minute. Like, I really want to work in real estate and nobody here goes into real estate. Oh, I should have looked into this more carefully at the entry part of this process. You should absolutely spend a lot of emphasis on what the career placements are, in terms of, not just in terms of like individuals and saying like, oh, well, 3 people here at this school got into, let's say, real estate and 10 people at another school did. It's more about the percentage of the class that goes into a given field is a good indicator to you of many things. Number one, it's an indicator that the recruiters are coming to this school and they are open to hiring people from this program. To use another example that isn't real estate, let's take Nike. I was recently corresponding with an Applicant Lab user who wants to work for Nike one day. And I said, oh my gosh, well, right off the top of my head, I know that obviously Nike recruits from the top famous schools, but they also have a really good recruiting relationship with the career services office at UCLA. So if Nike is one of those types of programs, one of those types of employers you want to work for, there are programs that have really good relationships with certain employers. The other thing that is beneficial about looking at the career report is that it gives you a sense of how much is that school's overall ecosystem supporting people who want to go into those careers. Entertainment and media is another example. If you've been on any of my webinars before over the past several years, if you really, 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 really want to work for Netflix, sure, target the top 5 schools, but also target UCLA and USC. You want to be in Los Angeles, right? So here's the thing. You're about to spend, let's say, I think the average cost of an MBA has gone up to over $200,000 US. And yes, scholarships are available, but sometimes they're not available. And so a lot of people find themselves having to take out, let's call it $150,000 US in debt. And so you don't want to get to the end of your 2 years, $150,000 in debt, have that sort of staring you in the face like, hey, the payments start in 6 months, yoo-hoo. And you don't want to be in a place where you're like, oh no, I didn't actually get the job I wanted. So I would look at career reports. Absolutely. I would also look at the clubs that are related to your field of interest. So I want you to find the club website, real estate club, media club, whatever club, and just go to the website and just get a sense of like, okay, is this a club with 2 students in it or 200 students in it? Is it a club that like has done 3 happy hours a year? Or is it a club that puts on a full-scale conference with invited keynote speakers, right? That makes a really, really big difference. So to the extent that one of the biggest reasons any of us went to business school was to enhance our career outcomes, you're going to want to really look at the career stuff. And that is something that not enough people pay attention to early on. People get blinded by rankings. And I often say, like, there's the overall rankings, which are made up by journalists. Some of them are not that great at being journalists, and none of them have actually gone to business school. So if you read some sort of report and you're like, well, I really want to go work at Netflix and I really want to work in Hollywood, but according to this ranking, UCLA is ranked beneath, I don't know, some random school in the Midwest. So maybe don't. The number one school for you is a school that can get you that career opportunity that you want. Don't pay attention to the other rankings. So, or, the overall rankings, because they were made by people who don't care about you, who did not go to business school themselves, and et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely. And then aside from that, I think the second part of the question was like sort of like all else being equal, what else should we look at? I would also look at school culture, culture and pedagogy, because you don't want to be in a program. For example, if you're someone who really, really just has nightmares about public speaking, sure, practicing some public speaking would be good. But if you really hate it and you never want to have a career or a job where you're public speaking, don't go to Harvard Business School. Don't go to a program where 50% of your grade depends upon how well you speak in front of 100 other people on a daily basis. So, or if you're really into, you're like, wow, I really want to bolster my quantitative skills. Pick schools that will offer those courses that are going to help you get to where you want to go, and pick schools that have the culture where you're more likely to make friends. Because at the end of the day, that's also the biggest benefit. You're going to spend a lot of money, but you're going to make some good friends. So me and my friend are planning to use Applicant Lab. Thank you. However, we also need some active feedback reassurance during the essay writing and other steps. How can we select a traditional additional consultant supplementing Applicant Lab? So thank you for your question. Some people don't seem to realize that at Applicant Lab, we offer these additional services. So you can, first of all, if you're going through the lab and you have questions, we have a support inbox, right? support@applicantlab.com. Send us your questions as you're going through, and either I or my colleague Karin, who is a Booth, she is a Northwestern undergrad, Booth alumna. She's worked at places like Bain and McKinsey, and now she works with me. I'm so lucky to have her. One of us will answer your question. So even a few seconds ago where I was talking about like, oh, someone was reaching out and saying, hey, I want to work for Nike after business school. Like, I know that because I will man the support inbox. And so, or just 2 minutes before I started this, I got a question about like, oh, here's my job, and I don't know how to quantify these experiences on my resume. So after I get off of this little session, I'm going to answer that person's question. So first of all, like, it's not like you just buy the software and then there's just an empty void on the other side. Like, there are real people. I'm a real person and I am behind the software, as is my colleague Karin. So there's a support inbox where if you have a question as you go through, you just ask us and we will answer it. Number one. Number two, for more intense feedback sessions, such as if you would like a full formal resume review or a review of your essays or a mock interview, we actually offer those as add-on services. Now, we charge a lot less than other consulting agencies do for those services, and here's why. We only make them available to people who have gone through the Applicant Lab steps first. Why does this matter? Because if you have gone through the Applicant Lab steps first, there is less of a chance that your materials are going to be hot garbage. Therefore, instead of taking me, say, 2 hours to do a resume review, it might only take, 45 minutes. The same is true for my team. So because the quality of your materials will be higher, hopefully, if you've gone through the steps and paid attention and thought about what I'm saying, then we don't charge as much for, say, an essay review as other people do, because the idea is that we have to do less work, right? So everyone wins. So if you're doing more of the work up front, why should you have to pay $500 for an essay review if hopefully you've already gone through the different steps, and therefore the essay you're sending us does not need so much work as, say, an essay that someone might otherwise send. So we actually offer these services. So between the two, the support inbox and the ability for you to hire Applicant Lab, we have Applicant Lab alumni. So these are people who actually used the lab themselves, went to a top business school, graduated from business school, and are now helping me in a part-time capacity with these reviews. So that's actually, we offer that. That's available, and it's less expensive for the reasons I just gave. All of that having been said, if you do want to go with a traditional consultant, no problem. A lot of people do this. A lot of people supplement. They'll you know, some people will, for example, hire an expensive admissions consultant and then buy Applicant Lab as sort of an insurance policy. I Not to pat myself on the back, but I often get notes from people who are like, "Hey, I hired a consultant and I'm using the lab, and your advice is so much more comprehensive." And I'm like, "Yes, thank you. That's why I built it." If I didn't think my advice would be better, I wouldn't have bothered building the product. But anyway, so a lot of people do both. So you can sort of mix and match and complement, use the two things to complement each other however you'd like. I would say that my personal advice for hiring an admissions consultant is I would go with a smaller firm or more of a solo practitioner. I would not go with one of those huge firms that have like 400 people. Because I actually have a friend who worked for one of these large firms. I won't name the firm, but and she quit because shortly thereafter, because she was like, I got no training. I got no, like, basically they were like, oh, you went to a fancy school. She actually asked, she had a client that she didn't know what to tell this client. And so she asked the person who was like the head admissions consultant at this large company, what should I tell this person? And that person said, look, you have an MBA from Kellogg. They're going to listen to you no matter what you say. So as long as you say something that is plausible, and if you say it with authority, they're going to believe you. And she was like, ew, this is gross. And so she quit and she didn't work for that firm anymore. But the larger firms are more likely to be like, let's just put butts in the seats. Let's just hire anyone who has a fancy MBA and just tell them like, look, as long as you say whatever you're saying with confidence, how is the person on the other side going to know the difference if it's good advice or not, right? So if you can swing it, I would prefer that you use a smaller shop, a more boutique shop, or individual people who are solo practitioners, but who have done this for at least, I would say, 10 years. So Rohan, this is a good segue. So you're a lab user, but you're unable to find an option to do one-on-one calls with me or Karin, just pre-recorded individualized feedback. Is there any way to schedule calls? So Rohan, this is the one thing we do not offer, our calls. And the reason is, if you actually go to our services page, I have maybe I didn't do a good enough job. I have a pretty good explainer as to why we don't do calls. The number one reason we don't do calls is because calls are massively inefficient. I used to do calls. And if calls worked, I would still do them. But I don't do them because they're super inefficient. Because here's what happens on a call. I will say something like, okay, so your resume, this bullet point here is terrible. And so what we need to do is, and the person's like, well, why is it terrible? And I'm like, well, hold on. And I'm like, because he doesn't do but that project was really important. I'm like, yeah, no, I know the project was important, but you didn't write about it and go, well, but I don't agree with it. And I'm like, okay, right? That's what happens on calls, is that the person will butt in and they'll start talking and I'll be like, no, but just give me a chance to finish. Right. That is something that happens. Number two, on a call, you have to write notes like the wind, right? You have to be like, okay, so I need to, and then if you go back 3 days later and you're looking at this chicken scratch that you scribbled, you're like, what does this even mean? I don't even remember. Right. And then the way how the calls work with other firms is that then you have to schedule another call to ask, what did we cover in the first call? So calls are not efficient. Too much interruption, too much stress of writing the note. So how it works with Applicant Lab is that you will send your materials and you will send questions you have along with the materials, right? Not really sure I'm hitting this point. What do you think about, like, the very first question we had where someone was like, oh, what should I say? Investment banking for PE. Like, people will say like, well, does this make sense? And so when we give you the recorded feedback, you get a video at the end. You will get your marked up file with our comments or changes in it. And you get our video feedback at the end. And the benefit with the video feedback is that, number one, there are no interruptions. Number two, you can just rewatch the feedback over and over again. So for example, if you book a service with us for round 1, and then like 4 months later, you're applying to round 2, and you're like, oh my gosh, what was the resume? Oh God, I don't remember. What did they say? They said something about this one essay, and guess what? You've got the recording. So you can just rewatch it as often. There's none of the stress of like, oh, I'm frantically taking notes. So the calls they don't work. We could make more money if we did calls, because A, we would be able to charge the going rate of $350, $400 per hour for them. B, we would be able to draw out the conversation, right? If I were a ruthless capitalist, here's what I would do, Rohan. I would get you on the phone. I would charge you $400 an hour. And I would say, so Rohan, tell me about yourself. How's it going? Are you having a good day? And I would try to drag out that conversation, because that way I make the most amount of money. I'm not about making money. I mean, I should be, but I'm not. I'm really bad at capitalism. But I love efficiency. And so our recorded things have efficiency. It's more efficient for us. It's more efficient for you. And then if you have follow-up questions, you just email us afterwards. So that's how we do things, because we are not about fleecing you and trying to get as much money from you as possible. If we were, then I would do calls all day long. Oh, okay. I'm using the lab. Really helpful. Thank you. Quick question. Do the accepted profiles in round 1 affect round 2 admissions? Some friends with similar profiles got interviews in round 1. Background in consulting. Okay. So, A Sensi. I think do the accepted profiles in round 1 affect round 2 admissions? For the Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, I don't think it necessarily does, because I think schools like Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton have a pretty standard way of judging people that does not necessarily vary tremendously from one round to the other. So what they are looking for is something that is, it's a pretty standard yardstick that they use from round to round. So theoretically, if you have friends with very similar profiles who got interview invites in round 1, then theoretically speaking, then in round 2, then you should also get an interview invite from those schools. A couple of caveats though. Number 1, you don't know what the personal story is of the person who's applying. So not that the personal story is like the be all and end all, but you might have 2 management consultants, and one of them was born into a wealthy family and went to boarding school and, has never, they work in consulting and they're good at it, but they've never really had to overcome anything, versus the other one who was homeless as a teenager and has had to have all kinds of tenacity to graduate from college and had to work 3 jobs. So all else being equal, the person who has demonstrated the most amount of tenacity in their personal life is probably going to be favored over someone, even if the resumes are identical, right? So number 1, you might not know what the personal story is of some of the people and what hurdles they have overcome in their lives that may or may not have an impact. On a perhaps much more relevant level, one of the challenges with being a consultant who's applying in round 2 is that, and I think we've actually done, Abhijit from GMAT Club, you might have a chance to pull this up somewhere. Not to drop this on you at the last second, but we did a thing about round 1 versus round 2. Remember, there was like a video. It was like Diana Economy from Ross. And anyway, I'll summarize it for you here. Basically, the rounds become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where most management consultants apply in round 1. Therefore, most schools take the bulk of their management consultants in round 1, because they know that they're like, okay, well, if usually management consultants apply in round 1, and right now is when we're getting them, now is when we should try to fill most of our management consulting seats. So the fields that tend to apply in round 1, the slight hiccup there is that there will be fewer spots available in round 2. I think the analogy I used in the other video was almost like having different fruits in season. So if it's summer and peaches are in season and you're like, oh my gosh, this is the time, this is peach time, so I need to buy the peaches now and make the peach pie now because that's what's in season. And I shouldn't really buy a lot of apples because I know that the apples are coming later on in the fall. I don't make pies, by the way. My husband does. But in case you're like, does she cook? I do not cook. But anyway, the point is, like, if you know that peaches are in season, that's when you're going to buy the peaches. Because you're like, well, I'm not going to get peaches later, and different fruits are going to be in season later. So it's not a great analogy, but hopefully it illustrates. If I'm an admissions officer And I'm thinking, okay, it's consultant season. Round one is when the management consultants apply. That's when most of them apply. Ergo, if I am targeting roughly, let's say, 20% of my incoming class to be management consultants, but 80% of management consultants apply in round one, there may be some so there are absolutely seats left over in round two for management consultants, but often a lot of the ones for this is consultants and bankers and also Indian engineers, a lot of those seats are taken in round one versus round two. So it's not so much about like, does the profile matter? It would be more, in fact, if some of your friends who have identical profiles already gone in round one, the good news is that it means that, yes, they would be open to someone with your background. The not so good news is that they might have already filled that seat. So if they're saying, okay, we want, we're gonna want one MBB consultant from the Dubai office, and we're gonna want 3 from London, and we're gonna want 1 from Spain. They might and if you're like, oh well, I'm an MBB consultant in Spain. So, and my friend got into Stanford in round one, so that means I can get in round two. Theoretically, yeah, but what if that person already took the seat that has been sort of mentally, there are no hard and fast quotas, but there's definitely a sense of they call it crafting the class. And so if they've already let in a bunch of people from your office or from your city is what I see, tends to happen more often, especially in the smaller cities, not smaller cities, but the more satellite cities, like say a Dubai or a Hong Kong or a Shanghai. If they've already taken those people, then in fact, that may not bode well for you, because the Shanghai McKinsey seat, we've already covered it. So I know that's probably not what you wanted to hear, but anyway, so yeah, so definitely look, apply and see what happens. And they do set aside. I don't want to say like, oh, all the consulting seats are taken. They're not. And in fact, that's why a lot of times people get pushed from round one to round two. So that's why, I don't know if you've heard of this thing called further consideration, or they get put on the wait list. That's when it's like, we like this management consultant, but let's see if we get some other people in round two that are kind of a little bit better, and then we'll compare them. So there are definitely seats for management consultants in round two. It's just that I wouldn't necessarily say, well, if people like you got in round one, that's a blessing and a curse. It's a double-edged sword. Rohan, I'm a management consultant at a Big Four and a professional stand-up comic. Nice. Can you tell schools you want to join MBB, post MBA, and work with clients in entertainment? It leverages my comedy experience as well. So Rohan, I have a couple of concerns with this. If you've never worked with entertainment clients, I think it's less about like, hey, I'm a stand-up comedian on the weekends, therefore I'm going to work in entertainment. It shows that you have an interest in entertainment, but I don't know that it's a strong enough of a link for you to really, like, I wouldn't die on that hill. I wouldn't be like, I'm going to work with entertainment clients. I am Mr. Entertainment because I do stand-up comedy. That's a bit of a tenuous link. If you go to interview for, an entertainment-focused consulting firm, like the big firms all have their entertainment and media groups, but like, let's say in LEK, which is here in LA, and they have a pretty big media practice as well. If you're up against someone else who has worked with Disney or Fox or ESPN or whatever in the past, and you're interviewing for the job and they're interviewing for the job, and they're like, well, I've actually worked on the Disney Fox merger, and you're like, well, I'm a stand-up comedian, like, it's not going to be, it'll be like, oh, well, you're definitely interested in entertainment, but it's not enough. I don't think it's strong enough of a story personally. And the tricky thing with saying, well, I want to join MBB is that, yes, some people do successfully use business school to trade up, right? So people who are working at a Deloitte or a PwC or a Mercer or whatever, they can use business school to then get into a McKinsey or a BCG. I even had some friends in business school who went from a BCG to a McKinsey. Like within the MBB, they went from a B to the M, right? Um, but it's not necessarily, it's not like, oh, it's a slam dunk story. Because if I were an admissions officer and if I were in a grumpy mood, which I might be, I might say, well, if you're MBB material, why didn't you get that job out of college? Right? Why didn't you probably applied for that job in college? I'm just guessing. And you didn't get it then. So, so I don't know that I would die on the hill of I am going to use the MBA to get into to move up into the MBB world, because it happens, but it's not like guarantee, So I would, if you want to talk about that you want to stay in consulting, I would just say I want to stay in consulting, and just don't mention a specific firm at all, or say I would either go back to my current firm or I would try to find another firm, etc. And if you, yeah, I think that's what my tummy is telling me. That's what my gut is saying. So I'm going to stick with that. Hello, Maria. Hi, Rohit. All your content is super helpful. Could you please provide tips on how to address an employment gap of 5 to 6 months, which is a year before applying to business school? Of course. So most business schools in the application form will have a separate little box that says if you've been unemployed for 3 months or more, usually 3 months is the cutoff. If you've been unemployed for 3 months or more, use this little box to explain to us what happened. So, and then if a school does not have that in their application form, you will use something called the optional essay. That is like the catch-all. That's where, like, the optional essay is where you explain anything that needs explaining. So the employment gap will be addressed there. In terms of how to explain it, not all employment gaps are created equal. So there's the employment gap. There are good employment gaps and there are bad employment gaps. And so your job is to, if the reason for your gap was a bad reason, you want to try to sort of smooth over, kind of like push aside the bad parts and then focus on the good parts. So hopefully if you had an employment gap, hopefully during that time, not hopefully if you had an employment, but hopefully during your employment gap, you were doing something productive-ish. So maybe you were networking for a new job. Maybe you were taking coursework to prepare for a job change. Maybe you were doing volunteer work. Maybe you were caring for a relative who was having a medical issue, or you yourself were perhaps having a medical issue that needed addressing. You do need to explain what you did with that time to show that you weren't just sitting around watching Netflix. Also, if you took that time off to study for the GMAT, do not, under any circumstances, tell them that. I know that in India, there is more of a culture of quitting your job to study for exams. We don't do that in the United States. The idea behind the GMAT is that everyone is studying for it while they are also working full-time. So even if someone takes some time off to study for the GMAT and they get a really high score, but the admissions office knows that, it makes the high score seem less impressive, because it's like, well, of course you did well. You weren't working full time. Like, this is all you were doing. So I would hope that you did well. So anyway, if that's what you did, don't say that. Instead talk about productive things that you were doing. And when I said a second ago, like, there are bad reasons to lose your job and good reasons to not work, the bad reason, the negative is if you were at a job for sort of a short amount of time and then you left it, the question is, okay, so who's at fault here? Is it that the employer was like a toxic, horrible place to work? Or is it that this employee is a toxic employee who doesn't get along well with others? So if you need to be sure to really be careful how you message it. If it was that you went to work at a place and you were only there for a little bit of time and it was like, whoa, it was pretty horrible and they treated everyone horribly, I think you can say that, but focus on like what you don't throw them under the bus. Just sort of state it very matter-of-factly. And then, what was I going to say? Just focus on what you learned. Like, you know what? It was a hard lesson to learn. I left that job. But now when I applied for my current job, I made sure to, in the interview process, I made sure to ask X and Y and Z so that it never happens again. So try to focus on the positive. What did you learn from the experience and what did you do with that time? And that's where I would focus the bulk of the explanation. Okay, Mohit Bansal. Of course, there's a difference between the MBA application CV and a job CV. Of course, I agree with you. Hurrah. Can you please elaborate on what should be and shouldn't be on an MBA application CV? Oh, Mohit. So I won't go into an entire full list because I actually, there's actually a product out there called Applicant Lab that walks you through exactly what should and shouldn't be on your MBA resume. And I explain why I advocate what I do. That's applicantlab.com, applicantlab.com. But I will cover some of the things here. I think, so for a job CV, your goal with a job CV is to get your next job, right? So usually to the extent that your next job is probably some sort of extension of your current job, for a job CV, you are going to focus a lot of your energy on proving to that recruiter that you are very good at your current job. So you are probably going to focus on a lot of day-to-day skills that you use. You might say things like, oh, I use Tableau on a regular basis. I'm using Python and statistical software to do this work. You might also use a lot of jargon that is very specific to your industry and field, right? I'm doing a SaaS crypto bleep blah blorb JavaScript algorithm, whatever. Because a recruiter in your field is going to read that and be like, ah, I know exactly. Yeah, okay, that's cool. I love those algorithms. They're going to know what you mean. An MBA admissions reader, number one, is probably not going to understand any of the jargon from what you currently do. Number one. So don't use jargon that someone from outside of your field would not understand. If you are an engineer, this is particularly important because most admissions officers in MBA programs do not have engineering backgrounds. I don't think any of them do. Maybe one or two, like maybe one like MIT and maybe like one at, I don't know, Tuck or something, just randomly. But most of them have human resources backgrounds. So if you say something like, I'm a chemical engineer and I created a new method that does a polyethyl carbide reduction of the hydrogen molecule, whatever, they are not going to understand a word of that. Number two, they're not going to care because the point of an admissions officer, they're not trying to figure out, like, are you good for this next job that we want to hire you for? They're trying to figure out who's going to be in this applicant pool, who's going to be amazing 20 years from now. Who's most likely to go on and impact the world in a really positive way, not next year, but in 20 years. And so if you're really good as a chemical engineer at diethyl carbide, hydrogen molecule, whatever, who cares? Because honestly, hopefully, if you go to business school 20 years from now, hopefully you'll be some sort of CEO or senior business person. You won't be the person doing the polycarbide, whatever molecule stuff. So if I had to pick one big change, is do not spend your MBA resume convincing them that you are very good at the technical aspects of your job. Because if all goes well, you won't be doing that job in 20 years. So why spend time proving to them that you're good at it? And they won't understand it anyway. So I think that's the biggest point. So that what should be there, what you do need to think about is like, okay, so what are the things that tend to lead to success in that 20-year time frame? And that is often leadership, interpersonal leadership, leading teams, convincing other people, pushing forth innovations that the organization has never done before, making an impact on the bottom line, right? Increasing revenues or decreasing costs, convincing your company to enter a new market. Those sorts of things are the transferable skills that point to success in a business career in the long term. So those examples from your career, that is what your MBA resume should focus on, and not the butyl carbide, oxy, whatever. I did not take organic chemistry, so I'm making up words. Ahmad Mustafa. Hi, Maria, lab user here. Thanks for using the lab. Yay. Quick question. Even though Columbia says it does not have rounds per se, and it does have rolling admissions, is that effectively true given how and when applicants apply? Okay. So they do have rolling admissions, but I think something like at one of these admissions conference I attended once, I think something like 85% or more of people apply to Columbia before their January deadline. So they have a deadline that's not an admissions deadline, but it's a scholarship deadline, right? It's sort of like the merit-based scholarship deadline. I think almost all applications to Columbia come in before that deadline. Mostly because if you apply afterwards, it means you're not getting a merit-based scholarship, which is something that most people are trying to get. So yeah, it's rolling admissions up until April or whenever it is that they have, but it's not really rolling admissions, right? Like, first of all, if anyone needs a work visa, you should apply, or sorry, a student visa to come study in the United States. You should apply as soon as possible, because then if you get in, you're going to need probably a couple of months for that paperwork and that whole circus to go through all of that process. So even if somebody amazing applies at the end, it says say April, that means they get in May. But if classes start in August, that might be cutting it a little close. So I think international applicants should apply as soon as they can. I think anyone, which is most people looking for scholarships, should apply significantly prior, because human nature being what it is, if they say the deadline is January 6th, then everyone's going to submit their application on January 6th. So my advice to you would be to try to submit it late December, something like that. So at least that way you're not in that crush. Your application might not be gotten to before the holidays, but at least you won't be in that sort of avalanche of those last minute applications. So if you're applying to Columbia, the answer of when to apply to Columbia is as soon as you can at any point. And definitely probably before January 5th. Now, if you are in the fortunate position where you can afford to pay for the entire degree yourself and you do not need a merit scholarship, then maybe wait until a little bit after the January 5th. So then that way you're signaling to them like, hey guys, like, I don't need, I don't need a lot of money to come to your school. And then they'll be like, oh, really? Well, it's not that people get in just because of that, but it certainly helps. So anyway, so Columbia, as soon as possible, and at the latest, that sort of January deadline. Rock wants to know, hi, I applied to around 10 schools in round 1. It's a lot of schools. I've been rejected by 6 schools so far. What's the best way to reevaluate the application for round 2? Okay. So first of all, I first of all, I love that you sort of spread out your risk by applying to 10 schools. I think off the top of my head, one of the challenges of if you did apply to 10 schools in round 1 is that I worry that you may have diluted your efforts. And so instead of submitting like 5 really strong applications, perhaps you submitted 10 good but not like awesome because humans are what we are, and we unfortunately don't have an infinite amount of energy and intellect. So if you were diluting your efforts across 10 schools, there's a chance that maybe you may have been better served by really focusing closely on a few applications and making them super strong instead of doing 10. So that having been said, you've been rejected by 6 schools so far. So right off the bat, the number one, look at your stats, right? The stats are not the be all and end all. So good stats don't get you in, but bad stats can keep you out. So look at your GMAT scores, keeping in mind that the average score for a class is in fact the average. And there are different metrics for different buckets of applicants. So people from overrepresented groups like the management consultants, for example, if a school's average is 700, the management consultants and the Indian engineers and those other overrepresented groups might want to go for a 730. You might want to go for about 30 points higher than the average. Conversely, if you are from a very underrepresented group, let's say you've been running a nonprofit in sub-Saharan Africa, something like that is like very different and very interesting, then, if your GMAT score is below the average, you might still be in good shape. So number one, check your stats. Also check the years of work experience, right? If a school has an average of 4 to 5 years of work experience and you have 10, it might be a non-starter at that point. Beyond that, assuming that your profile is in fact solidly competitive for these programs, one of the biggest reasons people get rejected is because their career vision doesn't make sense. So if with the very first question we had today, if someone were to say, well, I'm an engineer today and I'm going to go work in private equity the day after I graduate from business school, it's going to seem unrealistic. A school is going to get cold feet because they might worry like, oh, what if we can't get this person this job? And then they'll be mad at us. So the career vision, that all needs to make sense. As we touched upon a few minutes ago, the resume needs to make sense, right? A lot of people, especially people in technical roles or who are in very niche types of fields, like, what was some I saw the other day, like the maritime shipping industry, it was like all this stuff about like port fees at ports and tariffs. And I'm like, I don't understand any of this. So if your resume was very technical or very focused on niche elements, that could be another thing. And I think if you have time, reach out for some of your round 2 schools, reach out to current students, right? If you are in the maritime industry, well, it's a pretty small industry, but let's say you're in the finance industry, reach out to the finance club. If you're from South America, reach out to the South American Students Organization, right? Whatever it is, like try to reach out to students and just be like, hey, like I'm applying and, just curious, what do you think about my profile? They might be able to give you some feedback, but either you overreached for schools that you weren't actually competitive for, sorry, or you were competitive, but the application just didn't come together in the way it should have. And then finally, even if your reasons were really good, if a school can tell that you didn't spend any time researching them, like especially like a Cornell that we were talking about before, if you're like, hey, I'm applying to Cornell and I want to go to Cornell because I love New York City, right? And they're like, oh, we're not actually the tech program's in New York City, but we're not in New York City. We're in a place called Ithaca, right? So showing that you've done that homework also matters a lot to some schools. So schools will not often, but they will sometimes reject a very strong candidate if they get the sense right off the bat, like, this person is not coming here. I have seen, not to name names, but I'm going to name a name. I have seen Kellogg do this countless times. I have seen Kellogg reject people who then go on to get into Harvard, Stanford, Wharton. And I think, and I asked their head of admissions this, the former head of admissions at a conference, and she's like, we don't do that. And I'm like, yeah, but it happens a lot. I think that Kellogg is like, look, this person's really strong. And even if we let them in, they're probably not coming here. But if someone's really strong and they're like, hey, I have spoken to 4 students and I attended the virtual conference of blah, 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 and Kellogg is therefore my number one choice, I believe it. So if you didn't do any of that homework to show the schools that you care, that could have also been the thing that did you in. Okay. How do schools look at someone who wants to go from entrepreneurship to the corporate sector? So this can be a perfectly fine story. I think one of the best ways to frame it could be that you want to go back to learn best practice. Like, I was an entrepreneur, boy, it was really hard. And I feel you, man. Whew. It was really hard. And, but so I think I want to continue to be an entrepreneur in the long term. But first, I realize that I'm lacking the following business skills, hence the MBA. And also I want to go work at a place like, I don't know, maybe not Microsoft. They might be too big. But I want to work at a Series B funded startup or some larger company maybe, so that I can learn best practices from them. I can learn which mistakes to avoid. And then if I ever try entrepreneurship later on, I'll be better off. If you, in fact, previously worked in the corporate world and now are currently doing entrepreneurship, then it's a little bit easier because then you can say, well, I've learned a lot from, don't put down the entrepreneurship thing, use the silver lining technique, right? Like, well, I've learned a lot from this, but it's also made me realize that I do better when I'm surrounded by large groups of people. That's where I get my energy from, or something like that, whatever it is. And in order to go back to the corporate world, it's not that you need the MBA to go back to the corporate world, but that you would probably also want to make some sort of a functional shift as well. Because if you used to work in a big corporation and then you did a startup, you could probably go back to a big corporation again without the MBA. But if you want to make also a functional switch, say to strategy or marketing or something that you haven't worked in before, then the MBA makes sense. So I don't think it's a deal breaker if you're just sort of honest with why you want to go back to the corporate world and not just like, I want to make money again, even if that's really the truth. You can't say that. It has to be more about the experience and the learning and the whatever. Hi, Maria, Applicant Lab. Yes, my content is always excellent. Thank you. I would have answered your question even if you wouldn't have said something nice to me. Entrepreneurs working for very early stage startups, how to market ourselves if we haven't generated a revenue yet. So there are lots of ways that you can try to demonstrate that your startup, even if it hasn't generated revenue, that it is gaining some sort of traction. For example, it could be maybe you've signed a partnership deal with a bigger company. Maybe you've gotten some investment from, maybe you haven't generated revenue yet, but maybe you've been able to raise a certain amount of money as investment. You can at least talk about what the milestones are, right? That you have hit, right? I've hired a team. We've developed a prototype. We are currently showing the prototype to large corporations to see if they will buy our product or whatever it is. So you might not have the revenue benchmark, but surely you have other benchmarks along the way. The thing that concerns me a little bit more is that if you recently, if you're very early stage right now, then it just might be a question of like, well, wait a minute, why would you then abandon that company to go to business school 9 months from now? So that's the thing that gives me more pause than, oh, well, the startup hasn't really done a whole lot yet, especially if you have other like blue chip stuff in your past. That helps allay the fears about a current startup that's very new. But I think the question I have is more like, okay, so I started this company because I'm really into, the mug industry, and I have a passion for mugs, and I started the mug company, and now I want to go to business school. It's like, well, wait a minute, if you're so passionate about mugs, like you're abandoning all your mug brothers to go back to business school. So like, how committed are you really to this? I started the company because I'm super committed and I'm super passionate, but I'm not passionate enough to stick with it. And that's why I'm abandoning them in August of next year to come to your program. So it's a little bit, if you are an entrepreneur, you may want to address, like in the optional essay, for example, something like, if you have a co-founder, like, oh, my co-founder is ready for me to, we've talked about succession planning, and my co-founder is ready to take over for me while I'm in school, or something like that. Yeah, let me know if I didn't cover everything. And if you're a user, you can just email support and within a couple of days, someone will get back to you. Hemont wants to know, I have a 710 GMAT, but a low GPA of 1.5. 8 years of work experience, good leadership, well-rounded profile, international exposure. Is your profile strong enough to apply to top schools such as CBS? So, Hemont, I don't know if the work experience would be enough here to counteract the low statistics, the low quantitative things that you would be submitting. The GPA of 1.5 is a problem. It's a pretty big problem. It's not necessarily a deal breaker though, because we can, especially if you graduated 8 years ago, we can always say things like, oh, well, we were less mature then, or we were working, or whatever it is. Like lower GPAs are much more forgivable, but low GMAT scores aren't. And normally, if you think about it like as sort of as a balance beam or a seesaw, or some scales, if someone has a low GPA, they're going to need a higher GMAT to try to bring that academic picture into balance. When somebody has a low GPA, has like a low GMAT and a very low GPA, it's too, I think it's just too difficult for the admissions officer to get over that, if you know what I mean. Like, it's like, okay, we can forgive one thing, but if you have a very low GPA, you need a very high GMAT to counterbalance it. And with a 710, 710, you're already below the averages at all of the top schools. And if you are from an overrepresented group, i.e. the Indian male group, as I said earlier, you're going to want to aim for 30 points higher. So in other words, you should deduct 30 points. If you have a 710 right now, if you are from a very overrepresented group, that's the equivalence of, let's say, a 680 someplace, in terms of the average applicant. So 680 with a 1.5 is not great. And then also the fact that you already have 8 years of work experience, you may be a little too old or a little too senior for many of the MBA programs. What I would urge you to do is to look at, first of all, I would urge you, in terms of this season, I think it's going to be tough to apply to a top program. If you really want to go to CBS, I would look at their J-term program. That is a program that starts in January and you just go straight through. You don't get a summer internship, right? But that could be that the J-term is the option that is great for certain buckets of people who are sponsored by their companies, people who are entrepreneurs, people who work for family businesses, and also people who are more seasoned like you. Because you're not going to need, you can just make the argument like, I'm not going to need the summer internship. And then if CBS were your number one choice, I would tell you to retake. You can't do anything about the GPA. It's history. It's ancient history. You can't build a time machine. But the GMAT you could try to retake. And if the GMAT, if you're like 710s as high as it's going to get, Maria, cool, I get it. Maybe take the executive assessment. I think Columbia accepts the executive assessment that we were talking about earlier, or the GRE, and then apply to the J-term if that's what you want to do. In terms of other top programs, I do think it will be the combination of the low academic performance plus your advanced age makes it tougher. The programs that are more open to older candidates tend to be either one-year programs. So there's a one-year program at Kellogg. There are some prerequisites of classes you have to take in advance, but you can just sign up for them after you get in. Cornell, if you have an advanced degree already, or a CPA, or I think even a CFA, you can apply to Cornell's one-year program. And then look at programs in Europe. Europe and Canada do tend to be more open to more seasoned candidates. I noticed that I did not use the word old. I used the word more seasoned. So, but Columbia, I wish I had better news for you. And look, your leadership might be amazing, right? Like maybe you helped launch a new division of Apple, right? So if it really is amazing leadership, they will overlook the academics. But it would just take a lot. So you can go ahead and go for it, but go in with eyes wide open that unless there's something like really remarkable about what you've been doing in your career, I think it will be tough. I would love to be proven wrong, but I would be lying if I said that I thought it would be like a slam dunk. Jennifer Gonzalez. Hello, Maria. Thank you for hosting this meeting. Applicant Lab. Yay. Thank you. Yes. I thought my goals were clear from corporate finance to IB and then to corporate development. Okay. Do I have any advice on how to explain where your interest originated? So corporate finance to IB. So, I mean, I think the easiest in terms of, I would assume that just for the sake of easiness, that you're going to say that you want to stay in the same industry or a similar industry from where you work right now, just to reduce that friction. In terms of why am I interested in then corporate finance to then IB to then corporate development, this is where if you have spoken to anyone who works in corporate development, like let's say, here's sort of a plausible scenario that I imagine might have happened. You're working in corporate finance. The strategy team is like, hey, we might want to buy another company and we need some projections of what will happen. Jennifer, you're in finance. Can you help us put together these projections? Like maybe you helped the strategy team with some sort of analysis or collecting some sort of data or information with them and then for them. And then when you were working with them, they were like, oh, well, here's what we're thinking of doing. And you were like, wow, that's really cool. So you're thinking of buying this other company? Huh, that's super interesting, right? That might be where that interest originated. Or even if you never worked on a project with the strategy group, even just like talking to, like, if you haven't already, you still have a few weeks, try to find someone in the strategy group. It might be someone sort of more juniorish. Try to get on, try to talk to them and be like, what do you guys do? So then at least when you say, like, I've spoken to people, my counterparts in the strategy group, and what they're doing sounds really interesting. And then I ask them like, well, how do I switch from what I'm doing to what you're doing? And they said, I think corporate strategy could be the long-term goal no matter what. And then how I would present the short-term goals is like a plan A, plan B, right? So plan A, I would try to get that job directly. Plan B, though, based on people according to people I've spoken to, I might need to first go into banking. Therefore, that would be sort of like the plan B. So I would present it as like not an either, like this is definitely the plan, but like there are two different ways I could try to go there. Might have to do banking. And if so, that's what I'm going to do. And then either way, I want to work in corporate development in my industry because A, I think the work sounds really interesting. It's, I'm super interested in it. And B, I'm super committed to whatever your field is because it's either has some sort of personal interest for you or there's some kind of, great opportunity. Need more tea. There's some sort of great opportunity that's coming down the pike and I want to be a part of it 5, 10, 20 years from now. Let me know if that answers your question. I need to take a drink. 1 second. Sorry, my throat's a little dry. That's what happens when you talk for over an hour straight. Funny how that works. Okay, extended question with regards to merchant Navy profile. Whew. Okay, what are the recommended B schools for someone looking to venture into the operations industry, such as an Amazon Pathways operations manager? So this is why the earlier questions were such good questions, because what you're going to do is you are going to look at the school's career reports and figure that out. I think the good news for you is, first of all, the Merchant Navy profile. I honestly don't know a lot about the Merchant Navy. But for your application, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to try to find what are those transferable skills. So you might say, well, Merchant Navy to Amazon logistics is kind of that's a pretty big jump. But maybe in the Merchant Navy, you are organizing where things need to go, right? Maybe you have some sort of operational aspect to what you're doing. So that's something that you can highlight in terms of, okay, guys, here's why I think Amazon will hire me. In terms of schools that hire, the good news is Amazon is, I believe, the number 1 largest hirer of MBAs out there. So the good news is you do not have to go to a top 5 or honestly even a top 10 school to get a job at Amazon. I am not fully aware of what the Amazon Pathways operations manager, that particular recruiting cycle, I'm not familiar with, but I will tell you, all kinds of schools send people to Amazon. Even the 1-year programs, like I think Cornell Tech the NYU Tech, the Cornell Tech, those are the 1-year programs. I mean, all kinds of, University of Washington Foster, they're in Seattle. Hey, it helps. If you really want to do operations, I mean, obviously Carnegie Mellon Tepper is going to be, Tepper is one of the best schools out there for operations. So really any sort of quanti program is probably going to help you get a job at Amazon. Even like Indiana Kelly, like in other words, like schools that might not immediately be on your radar, I would think probably also send a lot of people to Amazon. So like even some of the Midwest schools, like I just mentioned, Indiana Kelly, Notre Dame. So I think the good news for you is if you really want to work at Amazon, you don't have to, it's not like, oh, you have to get into that top 5 school or it's not going to happen. Like the good news is you can apply to a broad swath of schools and probably do pretty well. Okay, David, Applicant Lab user, you're a reapplicant to Fuqua, ed tech and entertainment management background, edutainment combined. You recruited 2 celebrity clients, but you're hesitant to update Fuqua. You should totally tell them, David. Send them a little note, a friendly little note, and just say, hey, I'm making, just wanted to let you guys know that I'm making progress with my business or with whatever the project. I don't know if it's your full-time business or a side gig, but I'm making progress. You should absolutely, update them and just sort of then at the end be like, just wanted to let you know that, I can use this experience, that things are moving forward for me. And I just wanted to let you know this because hopefully it shows that I am, it helps prove that I am not prove. That's too on the nose, but it helps demonstrate my ability to grow this business. And this is also an experience, the experience of getting in touch with these celebrities will be beneficial for my classmates at Fuqua later on in terms of blank blank, and just come up with some reason why it would be an interesting lesson for others to learn. You should definitely, there's no downside to updating them. So go for it. Okay, Mohit Bansal, thanks for answering your previous question. How helpful is a GMAT waiver if you have a low GMAT? Your target school is Fuqua. 12 years of experience. Mohit, if you have 12 years of experience, I'm afraid you've got bigger issues to worry about than your low GMAT score, although your low GMAT score is low, right? If we subtract 30, if you are a male engineer from India, let's subtract 30 from that. So that's effectively you're applying with a 620. Again, this is not a scientific thing. This is just sort of the rule of thumb. So a 620 is probably 100 points lower than what Fuqua's normally. So that's a super low. So a GMAT waiver is not only helpful for you, it's the only way you're going to have a snowball's chance in a desert of like, you cannot apply with a 650. Like you're just not going to get in. Again, like the caveats exist. Like if you helped invent a time machine and Elon Musk has you on speed dial, like, okay, maybe. But barring that, you're not getting in with a 650. So you need to use the waiver. And 12 years of experience, I think you might be too old or too seasoned. So I would maybe start looking at some European programs or Canadian programs instead. Okay. At what point do you suggest a supplemental transcript? I have a 2.7 GPA from a no-name US private school in mechanical engineering. You work at FANG. You have a 730. You're unsure about T15 M7. So the supplemental transcript, I know some admissions consultants are like really into it. I think the effort, it's just so much easier to do well on the GMAT than it is to be like, okay, I'm going to take a calculus class at, UCLA Extension online, and I'm going to take this business math class at Berkeley Haas online, and I'm going to sign up for HBS core, and I'm going to right. Like I'm not a huge fan of the supplemental transcripts because it's not, unless it is something like HBX core, it's not something that people are necessarily going to be super familiar with. And so how do I judge, like, if someone takes the business math class at UCLA online versus the business math class at Berkeley online. They're both UC classes, University of California. So are they the same class? Is an A in one more impressive than an A in the other? I just think it's a huge pain in the butt. I only really recommend the alternative transcripts for people who are like, I was a basket weaving major, right? I was a finger painting major. I think for you, the 2.7, I mean, at least it was in mechanical engineering and it wasn't in finger painting. I think if you have, you absolutely have to address that GPA in the optional essay. It could be that you were working. It could be that you're the first in your family to go to college. It could just be that you were overextended with extracurriculars and you didn't pay enough attention to classes. If you are, I don't remember if you're a lab user or not, but if you are a lab user, if you go to the strengths and weaknesses module and you select like the low GPA, it'll pop up advice for how you can try to position it in the optional essay, depending on what your reason was for having a low GPA. I would ideally like to see a 750 plus, but 730 is average. M7 might, it depends what you're doing at the FANG company. You're in a tech. I think T15 could probably work. I think some of the, you might as well throw your hat in the ring for some of the M7s. I just, again, based on like, the applications are big for a reason, right? It really is a holistic process. But only knowing the little bits of information I have here, I do think that like a Harvard, Stanford might be a little bit tough. But I think there are definitely some T15 schools you could try for, and definitely try for some M7 schools too. Again, because if within tech you've been leading other teams or helping come up with cool new features that are gonna be really nifty for your FANG company, you know, I don't think this application is dead in the water. In other words, I think the 730 helps. It's just, I wish it were higher than the average, the school's averages by another, say 20 or 30 points, just because then it's like, well, they've got a low GPA. Like, remember the sort of seesaw, like, oh, the GPA is not so great, but whoo, the good news is we've got that bigger GMAT to balance it out. The 730, like, it sort of balances it, but it's not like a definitive balancing, if you know what I mean. But I don't, yeah, go for it. Just not maybe, you know, I think it'll be harder, but I don't think it's like impossible. Harsh wants to know, should I consider an MBA at the Carlson School of Management? You know, Harsh, I got to say, given the world that I play in, is Carlson, God, I don't even know off the top of my head. Is that the one? Is that in Minnesota? It is in Minnesota. Sorry, I just had to jump to another. I'm like, before you say Minnesota, Maria, you need to Google this and make sure it's in Minnesota. So I will admit that I am not as familiar with Carlson as I am with other programs. First thing, if you are from India, let's find out. Let's go back to this handy dandy Google. Let's see if it has a STEM certified. Okay, the Management Science MBA is STEM designated. Okay, so I just Googled Carlson MBA STEM designated. So they have one major at Carlson that is apparently, based on what Google just spit back at me, is STEM designated. And why does that matter to you? If you're from India, it matters because you will get guaranteed 3 years ability to work in the US after business school versus 1 year. So if you do want to go to Carlson, do that management science MBA, because that's going to give you the 3 years work visa versus the 1. When I think of Carlson in Minnesota, here, I think it's a solid program, actually. I think, though, like many programs that are very strong in their particular respective regions, realize that many of your career opportunities coming from there will be in Minnesota / the Midwest. Now, that's not a bad thing. Minnesota in particular, Minneapolis is actually surprisingly home to a lot of really big companies. Like, I think Target Best Buy. Best Buy is having some trouble now in the world of Amazon, but still, it's still a pretty good company. I think there are like some good healthcare companies too in Minnesota, like maybe Medtronic or one of them. I don't know. So just realize here's where looking at the career outcome report is going to be super helpful for you. I would suspect that most graduates of Carlson go to work for one of those big companies that's based in the Minneapolis area, and or they stay primarily in the Midwest. So look at where they send people, and ask yourself if that's something that interests you. And then the other thing I'm going to Google is average years of experience, just because the other thing is 4.74, 28.7 years old. Okay. So you might be a little on the young side, but my take on that would be I would apply this year, see what happens. If worst thing that happens, you might just have to reapply next year. But yeah, I would say go for it. Not not knowing anything else about you, go for it. Especially, but make sure that you want to live in Minneapolis. Not everyone does. Okay, a question from Aman, Indian, 38 years old. Served in Indian Air Force for 20 years. Got my BTech during the service, 730 GMAT. How hard will it be to get into top USB schools with a goal to get into management consulting? Obviously, anything is possible. If you were in the Air Force and you were sort of at a very high rank, if you were involved in, for example, I worked with a client once who was in the Air Force, in the US Air Force, who got into Stanford. And this was someone who was working on a sort of top secret design for a brand new plane. And they were doing a lot of really innovative things. And they were like project managing this like billion-dollar project. So that person got into Stanford. They were not 38 though years old. They were significantly younger. I think it will be a challenge for you to get into it depends what you mean by a top US school. I think it will be a challenge at the age of 38 for you to get into a top US school. And I think it will also perhaps be challenging to get a management consulting job, because while the management consulting firms, it's not that they discriminate against older people, but it's that the nature of management consulting work is work that is better suited to people who are younger. And that's my euphemistic way of saying that, if you're 38 now, you would graduate then when you're 40, 41. I don't know if you have a partner. I don't know if you have children. But many, many times once we get older, we don't have the stamina to work 80 hours a week anymore. And once we get older, if we have children, we might want to see those children, I don't know, every once in a while. And so it's not that management consulting, they don't overtly discriminate against older candidates, but older candidates tend to not stay in that job, even if they get it, because of the lifestyle considerations. So I personally would not apply with a management consulting story. And also the second part is that management consulting is usually a means to an end. Not a lot of people stay in management consulting their entire lives for the reasons I just mentioned. But so a lot of people might use it as a stepping stone to do something else. So if you're going to apply, I would stick with something military related. Like maybe you want to go work for a military contractor like a Raytheon or a weapons manufacturer or a plant like a Boeing. I don't know, like even like an aerospace company. But I think it will be difficult. I think given your age, what you may want to look at are the sort of the 1-year programs that are specifically for more seasoned candidates, called the Sloan Fellows Program. There's one at LBS, there's one at MIT, and then there's one called MSX at Stanford. That's for older. That is explicitly for older people who are looking to take a 1-year MBA. That will be much more likely up your alley. Kelvin Wang. I want to get engineered for undergraduate, but I got to pass with my master's degree in social science. I got to pass with my master's degree in social science. So, okay. So Kelvin, I don't the pass with my master degree in social science. So I don't know if you mean that there was one class that you took pass fail that you passed, or that the master's degree was not on an ABC or a 8, 9, 10 scale, but your master's degree was just a pass fail degree. If it was just a pass fail degree, I don't think there's a problem. If it's that you passed as in like you barely passed, like instead of like getting an A, B, or C, you just took everything pass fail and you just because it was hard. Most people take classes pass fail when they're not doing well. Um, so if that's the situation, I don't think it's like an automatic deal breaker. I think it depends what exactly the structure of this pass means. But I think that the primary thing they're going to look at when judging you is what you've done in the past 5 years in your career in investment banking. What have your accomplishments been there? So I'm a little confused by what you mean by a pass in a social science degree, but I'm not like, oh, bad news. So I don't think it'll impact things. It'll be more like you being judged against the other investment bankers who do get into HBS or CVS, right? Like, what deals have you worked on and how many clients have you presented to, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, passes the grade. Yeah, but I don't understand like the whole grade. Like you just passed everything, but it was pass fail. Anyway, I wouldn't worry about it. What you're going to be judged on is you're going to be judged against the other investment bankers who have 5 years of experience and who has accomplished more. That's the main thing that they're going to be looking at, especially at like a CBS, which is such a finance school. Indian male, 25, tier 1 undergraduate business college, 3 years management consulting with Deloitte. Target score for M7 plus T15. I would just, again, off the top of my head, take the average score and add 30. And also talk to other people at Deloitte in your office at Deloitte who have gone on from Deloitte to get into business schools, and they're going to have a much better sense of who tends to get into which programs from your office. Sorry, this was a short one. She's like, I'm used to Maria talking for 20 minutes for each question. Sorry, I didn't mean to catch you off guard. How would you narrow down a list of schools besides location? So I've got a whole thing. And by the way, this is part of the free trial in Applicant Lab. If you go to Applicant Lab and you sign up for the free account in the free trial, I believe in the to-do list module, I have a whole thing about how to choose a school. Location, I talked at length earlier in today's session on career outcomes. You're going to want to look at career outcomes. You're going to want to look at whether or not you're competitive. So you're going to want to try to find what I call the resume twins, which is someone who has a background as similar as possible to yours, who then got into a school. It's not a guarantee, but it's a good indicator that at least that school is open to people with your background. So yeah, it's a combination of like which schools would be good for me, but then also which schools do I have a shot of getting into. So that's going to be analyzing your competitiveness with your scores, your career, your accomplishments, and then looking at what do they offer, right? Which schools? Again, I'm like a floating disembodied head. Which schools offer? If you want to work at some certain program in Amazon, those are going to be different schools than if you want to work in investment banking for Moelis, right? So depends on your goals too. On reapplying, assuming the issues with my career vision, what is the best approach to reapply to the same schools with a modified career vision? So if your career vision was the reason you got rejected, what you have to do then is you have to say somewhere in the application that, last year I applied saying that I wanted to work in management consulting. The reason I thought management consulting appealed to me was because of the analytical challenges and the teamwork component. But in this, subsequent months, I started talking to people who work in management consulting, and I realized that what I really want to do is work for something different. It still has a lot of the things I like about management consulting. It's still challenging and involves teamwork, but it's a better fit for me given that my long-term goal is whatever. So pick something that makes sense in terms of being en route to the long-term goal, and then just sort of explain it that way. Like the number one thing you're going to be able to say is that I talked to a lot of people who either work in management consultant or who work in my dream field, and they were like, hey, you don't even need to do consulting, you can do this other thing. And that's how you talk about research. Applicant Lab user, yay! 4 years of experience as a banker. For personal health reasons, I left my job. For the past 4 years, you were preparing for some competitive exams. How to address this gap? Okay, so DM, do you mean that you have not worked for 4 years? Or do you mean you left your job recently? If you haven't worked for 4 years, that's, if we think about the fact that the schools want an explanation for people who have been unemployed for 4 months, and they kind of are like, we're a little curious about why you'd be unemployed for 4 months. Being unemployed for 4 years is going to be a pretty big hurdle to overcome, because first of all, if you were preparing for some competitive exams, they'll say, well, this person is not interested in an MBA, because if they were preparing for, say, a civil service exam, what they really want to be doing is civil service. They don't want to be doing an MBA. So they might sort of question that. But I think on a more pragmatic level, they are going to worry about putting you in front of their corporate recruiters who come to campus to hire people, and then those corporate recruiters saying like, okay, well, this person, what did this person do for 4 years? They didn't do anything, right? They were, well, not that you didn't do anything, but you didn't work. So how do you address this gap? I think a 4-year gap is quite the difficult. I don't know how you overcome that gap. I think what you should do is, if I'm guessing correctly, if you are from India, and I'm only assuming that because I've heard so many people from India say things like, I quit my job to study for this civil service exam. We don't do that here in this country, but I've heard a lot of people in India do that. Then I think your best bet will be to apply to business schools in India, because they will understand that they're like, oh, it's not a big, they won't be like, oh my God, 4 years. They won't be like horrified by it. They'll be more like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. I think US programs, because that is just such not a part of our culture here, you prepare for your exams while you work here. We're sort of workaholics in that sense. So nobody quits their job to study for an exam, and much less for 4 years. So I think for US programs, that would be really, really difficult, unless, of course, if you just apply to programs that are not necessarily super competitive to get into, and then you come, let's say, to the US, and you just try to find a STEM designated program, so that way you get that 3-year work visa, but at a program that has like a very high acceptance rate, like a 90%, like, a super high acceptance rate. And then I think that will be the best use of your time in terms of US programs. Look, you can apply and you can try to explain it, but I think it will be difficult in terms of admissions, and also in terms of you getting a job afterwards. I don't know that a lot of US employers would be super excited to bring on someone who hasn't worked for 4 years. I think that will be difficult. I'm a 23-year-old Indian with 3 years of work experience in a startup. Am I too young to apply to most MBA programs? You're not too young, Raj. I think the question that I would have is, a lot of it just comes down to impact. So if you've been 3 years at a startup, but that role has been, I've been the QA tester for the software, I'm the person who logs the bugs, and I manage Jira or whatever it's called. Probably not. But if you have been pushing or leading, pushing forth new initiatives at the company or leading cool new projects at the company, then it will be better. I do think you're a little too young. I would like to see you apply with 4 or 5 years of work experience, not just because, age is just a number, not just because I'm randomly pulling a number out of the air, but because I would guess that at that mark, that gives you 1 or 2 more years to really, make some big impact at your company. Oftentimes at the 3-year mark, folks have not had a chance to lead a product team, for example. So it's not simply about your age. It's in part, it's largely about what impact you've had, but I'm guessing that at age 23, I'm not saying you haven't had impact at age 23. I'm saying you will probably have much more impressive impact 1-2 years from now. So I would try to wait until then to apply. Indian chartered accountant, female 29, financial analyst in Hitachi Energy. Work experience, GMAT 700. Which European schools can I target? Okay, so for European schools, you're working at Hitachi, so that's a Japanese company. If you have had opportunities to work overseas, like if they have been like, oh, we're going to send you to, now this is another one. Let me just Google this real quick, from Japan. And then it's like, it's not Japan, you fool. It's Japanese, right? This is what happens when I drink tea instead of coffee, because tea is delicious, but it doesn't have as much caffeine. So my brain's a little slower. Okay, great. So they definitely are Japanese. I knew that. I just wasn't 100% sure. Anyway, if they have sent you to Japan for 6 months, so you've had an opportunity to get to know the culture or things like that, then I think you could, that's what some of the European programs, like for example, INSEAD really looks for significant international experience. So if you have significant international experience, you're working for an international company, if that has come along with international experience, then you could try to target, the schools that will be interested will be much larger. The 700, I wish that 700 were higher, just because it is so competitive. I think part of it depends what you want to do with your career also. So for example, if you are interested in anything related to social enterprise or trying to solve big societal problems, I think in Oxford, let me pull up. Oxford's a 690, I think. Yeah. So Oxford says that anything above 650 is competitive, and their average is a 690. So Oxford might be an interesting one for you to look at. It depends exactly. You say your job is financial analysts. It's not clear to me how senior of a position that is. Is it sort of a more entry level position, or are you managing others? The HBS and IMD, in my experience, they tend to prefer people who, like you, who have a big company, who have big company experience on their resume. So that might work in your favor. However, they do also tend to look for more people who are senior, people who have led teams. And it's hard for me to tell from the title financial analyst. So I think maybe an Oxford and a Cambridge could be good, especially if you have a career vision. You say energy, right? You work for the energy division. So Oxford, they like people who are trying to solve big global problems. So if I had to pick one right now off the top of my head, I would say that would be the one I would target, because energy is a big global problem. Should we ask recommenders to write the recommendation themselves? No. Or sharing a complete draft work as well. My recommender asked for the latter. I'm nervous about the writing style similarity. So you should be nervous. Here's what I recommend instead. for the recommenders, my recommendation for the recommenders is I would provide an outline to your recommender with like bullet points. And if you want to go deep, you can go into like sub bullet points of like, here are the things I think I would like for you to talk about. So that way they will still write it in their own voice, but you're not writing it for them. But if you're providing a bunch of bullet points, they don't have to think very hard, which is what I am guessing. Like they just don't want to put it, they just don't have the time or the put in that kind of effort. So you're doing the effort, but just having them sort of, the ideal would be that if you give them bullet points and then they rewrite it, they use those bullet points to write it themselves. Because you're right, people don't realize that they have a voice when they write, and that it's kind of, I'm pretty good at guessing when someone wrote their own recommendation. So you're correct to be nervous about that. So maybe bullets could work. Ask them. Okay, what about underrepresented applicants and test scores? Yes. How do you compare with the averages? You're Peruvian and you got a 710, MIT average is in the 720s. So just like how the overrepresented groups that are overly competitive need to like add 30 points, the fact that you're 10 points below, 10, 15-ish below the average-ish, I think that should be okay. And the reason I say that is because it's not just because it's like, oh, people from Latin America have it easy, but part of it is that my hope would be that if your quant score is, say, 48 or above, and let's assume that the 710 is because you did well in quant but not so well in English, because most people in Latin America, English is not their primary language, obviously. It is also not the language that they are educated in, right? Even people who go to English language high schools in a place like Peru, the universities are all taught in Spanish. So since the language of instruction is also Spanish, people who are from non-English speaking countries tend to get more of a pass if their verbal score is a little bit lower. This is why in India, because so many people go to university that is taught in English, that's why the bar is higher. So it's not like, oh, they're discriminating against me because I'm from India and these people from Peru, it's a little bit easier for them. No, it's because if you're from India and you're watching this video, there's a really good chance you went to a college that was taught in English. There's a really good chance you've been learning English. I know that English is not, English is spoken on some level in India, certainly far more widely spoken than it is in Peru. So when it comes to GMAT scores, there is more leniency with people, especially on that verbal side, because obviously, and if you're grumpy about this because you're like, well, what if the GMAT were given in Spanish? How well would you do if it were given in Spanish? Right? You probably wouldn't do so well. So that's where that leniency can come in with people from, say, Latin America, because it's like, well, okay, like it's not you haven't had nearly as much education in this language as other people have. So knowing no other information, I think a 710 should still be okay. Reach out to the Latin American club though at Sloan and just sort of ask them like, hey, like, what do you guys think? But I would think it would be, I think you're close enough. Christopher, I'm 33 with 10 years of experience in supply chain. Global, 3.0 GPA, 720 GMAT. How realistic are my school choices? Columbia, Emory, and Vanderbilt. I think Emory and Vanderbilt could work. I think I would also, again, just because supply chain always, to me, sets off the bell of Carnegie Mellon. I would also look at Tepper and Christopher Pitts. I am only saying this because your picture is showing up. And because of that, I can see that you are African American. If you have not looked at the consortium for graduate study in management, please apply through the consortium. You will have to write a couple of extra essays. Yes, that's bad news. The good news is you have to pay less to apply, and it would be really beneficial for you. So I realize that I'm on a forum right now where not a lot of people can qualify for the consortium, but definitely look up the consortium for graduate study in management. Columbia just joined the consortium this past summer. So you could list them as your number one choice. I think Tepper is one of Carnegie Mellon's another one too. I don't know that Emory or Vanderbilt are in the consortium, but anyway, try to apply through the consortium. It helps put a positive sort of flag on your application. Yeah, it's not that I don't think you could get into an Emory or Vanderbilt. It's just more like I just don't know that I associate those. Oh, well, if you want to be in like the Southeast, I was going to say I don't associate those programs with like operations type careers necessarily. But yeah, I think it should work because even though, I think that I think it would work for those programs. Depends. I making sure that they would be good fits for you based on what you want to do. I think it could be okay. Hi there. I hold a PhD with 5 years of experience in a startup and in an NGO. If you prefer to work in an NGO in the future. So, I mean, there's not a lot of information here. You have experience in a startup and an NGO. So, in terms of schools that you would be competitive for, this is again where I promise I have more tricks up my sleeve than the words resume twin, but I say it over and over again because it's true. You need to find your resume twins at various schools. So for example, for someone to get into, say, a Stanford from the NGO space, their accomplishments probably need to be a bit stronger. Well, from a Stanford, it has to be significantly stronger than someone who goes to some other school from the NGO space. So in terms of assessing your competitiveness at the programs, assuming that your GMAT score and all that stuff is fine, it comes down to like, okay, like, what are you doing for the NGO? Are you simply analyzing data alone in a dark basement where you don't talk to other people? Or are you meeting with government officials and convincing them to invest in malaria nets that are going to save hundreds of thousands of lives, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like some people work for NGOs and they just sit quietly and they don't talk to people. Other people are working for NGOs, and as part of that, they are meeting with the health minister for a nation and convincing that country's government to invest more money in a certain initiative. So those are like the two ends of the spectrum that just occurred to me. In terms of your competitiveness, it's going to depend which end of that spectrum you're on in terms of accomplishments. In terms of NGO programs, most schools have solid social enterprise programs. You may want to, because the social enterprise careers pay less, you may want to focus on schools where you're more likely to get a scholarship. And the easiest way to figure that out is to figure out a school where let's say your GMAT score is, say, 50 or 60 points above the average. That's going to make it more likely that you get a scholarship, just because, it'll be harder for you to pay back those loans. Also, a few schools do have loan forgiveness programs, but it's not ever complete. I don't think it's ever. Maybe Stanford has a complete loan forgiveness. You might get like $10,000 knocked off of your student loans or something like that for every year that you work in nonprofits. But so look for those programs. I associate most top schools with social enterprise, Tuck, for just ones that randomly jump out at me in no particular order: Tuck, Kellogg. Booth is trying really hard to get into social enterprise. So if you have a very quanti analytical background in social enterprise, Booth could be a good fit for you. But yeah, most schools will help you get jobs at NGOs. So I think you can make something happen. Ujwal wants to know, how would you plan an application for round 2 if you have not given the GMAT yet? So hold on. Today is the 7th of December. Hold on. I'm going to look at my calendar. I'm not going to actually look at my calendar. First of all, Ujwal, oh, is that your kid? What a cute kid. So I would brew up the most powerful, just coffee, not even by the pot. I would brew it up by like the gallon. I would just have gallons of coffee because the next 4 weeks are going to be really challenging for you. In terms of your application, the biggest thing that you cannot control in this process is your recommenders, right? Because if you have to pull a few all-nighters, especially if you have a baby, you know what it's like to pull all-nighters. So you can always pull an all-nighter to try to like throw together an essay in a night. I don't recommend doing it, but you could do it. What you can't do is you can't force your recommender to put together a recommendation in a night. So right now, if you haven't already picked your recommenders and alerted them and asked them if they'd be cool with it and started getting that ball rolling, I would get that ball rolling today, right? Because the new year is coming. We are reaching a point where many people go on holiday. You're not going to want to reach out to your boss on holiday and be like, hey, I know you're on vacation, but can you write this recommend? It's due in 3 days, right? You can't do that. So the first thing I would do is make sure that your recommenders are ready to go. Regarding taking the GMAT and writing your essays at the same time, given it depends. Let's say that you're going to split your time exactly down the middle. You've got 4 weeks. Let's say you're going to take the GMAT in the middle of December. Between now and then, I would only focus on the GMAT because I wouldn't want you to dilute your attention and then, oh, I didn't do as well as I could have because I spent 3 days on this essay instead of studying for the GMAT. I would not want that to be the situation. So I would, let's say you're splitting the time evenly. I would spend all of the time focus on the GMAT, and then I would switch to the essays. And I would also get coffee. I'm drinking tea this morning. It's delicious, but the caffeine's not enough for me. I'm learning. I got a startup and got laid off. Joined a startup and got laid off in 6 months. Will this be looked upon negatively? I mean, it's not great, but it happens. So assuming hopefully the layoff was not super long ago, hopefully it was only within the past couple of months, then, I mean, look, it's obviously no one's first choice, but assuming that prior to those 6 months at a startup, if your career before then was pretty solid, i.e. you spent 2+ years at one employer, you did well there, you have solid accomplishments under your belt from your pre-startup experience, that is going to help. And yeah, so searching for the job, what I would say is if you're searching for a job right now, you should be, in terms of what you tell business schools, you should be searching for sort of temporary 6-month type projects, right? Because you're going to leave, if you're successful in getting into business school, you're going to leave in August. So it wouldn't be cool if you apply for a full-time job, like in real life, apply for full-time jobs because you don't know what's going to happen with the MBA process, right? So definitely apply to full-time jobs. But for the purposes of the MBA, you can say like, oh, I'm trying to find project work that will be like a 6-month or an 8-month long project. 6 months is safer. It's just so that way I can, right? Because otherwise it's like, wait, you're going to start a job, they're going to train you, and then you're going to be like, so long, suckers, right? So that doesn't make you look very loyal. So yeah, I mean, I think, look, it is what it is. In an ideal world, this wouldn't have happened. But I think if it happened relatively recently, and if you're doing good things with this time productively, I don't think it's necessarily a deal breaker. But you're probably going to be in better shape if you get a job like right now and then apply a year from now, I would guess. But you might as well try. Last question. Abhishek needs to go to bed. What do profiles of individuals who get into top 10 schools with a low GMAT look like, i.e. 650? Lazy to care one. This is fun. I like it when people have fun little names. Okay, lazy to care one. When people get into top 10 schools with a low GMAT, what does it look like? It can look like a lot of things. 650 is pretty low, right? So like I'm thinking off the top of my head, when I think low for a top 10 school, I usually think 700, 690. 650 at a top 10 school is tough, especially top, like the top of that top 10. But it's possible. It would usually be someone, first of all, if that GMAT score, again, as we were saying earlier, if it's because of the verbal, because someone is from a country where English is not the primary language or English is not heavily taught in the school system, and if the verbal is the reason for that 650 being as low as it is, assuming the person has, say, a 48 quant, 47 is sometimes acceptable, but ideally at least a 48 quant, they might be willing to overlook the score. The number one reason would be if somebody has just made a massive amount of impact in their career so far. So, for example, I helped someone get into HBS in Stanford a few years ago who had a low GMAT score. It wasn't 650 low. 650 is pretty low. But it was below the average. It was below 700, I think. But this person had literally worked for one of the world's largest electronic companies and had helped them set up new offices and launch in new regions of the world. And this person was managing, I believe it was $100 million P&L, and it was indirectly managing a team of 2,000 people for one of the world's largest electronic companies. So that person got into Harvard and Stanford, but that's because their professional background, their level of impact was so high that it was obvious that this person, and I think the CEO of their company was like, this person has been shortlisted to perhaps become the CEO one day. So, like, it was like a really spectacular, when people say like, I have a strong leadership profile, I'm like, is it though? Like, some people have strong leadership profile is pretty subjective. So this person had literally the CEO wrote the recommendation and was like, this person has been shortlisted for being like perhaps the future CEO of this billion-dollar company. So that person got in with a lower GMAT to both Harvard and Stanford. So if somebody has like amazing impact, then the GMAT score is more willing to be overlooked. So yeah, it's either you either didn't have the same educational opportunities as others, i.e. maybe you're from a very low income background, maybe you're from a country where English isn't the native language, but almost always it's balanced out by some sort of incredible accomplishment. Or maybe your dad's a billionaire. Like if your dad's Jamie Dimon, you're probably getting it. Is it okay to talk about being LGBTQ in essays? Ashu, I love your profile pic. Woo, so colorful. Of course it's okay to talk about it. Why wouldn't you? How is the applicant viewed from the admissions committee? They are viewed no differently than an applicant who has any other identity. So if you are LGBTQ and that's just part of your identity, and that's great, but you haven't really done anything in terms of advocacy, volunteer work, running a club, doing fundraisers, things like that, then I really wouldn't emphasize it too much. But if being LGBTQ is part of your identity, and also that has inspired you to take a lot of leadership action, it's the leadership part that's going to matter, not the label that goes with it, right? Because there are some people out there who are LGBTQ applicants who have done a whole bunch of advocacy work, but there are also people who are like women who have done a lot of advocacy work for women, or people who are Latina. And I've done a lot of advocacy work for the Hispanic community. So people have done advocacy work, the Asian American Pacific Islanders will do advocacy work for their group. Like there's a lot of different people, there are a lot of different identities out there, and a lot of us have belonged to one or more identity. But some people are just simply a member of the identity, and it informs a lot of who they are as a person, but it doesn't really inform a lot of their leadership, versus other people have taken significant leadership strides as a member of that community. And if so, then obviously emphasize the leadership. The leadership is what's going to matter, though. The whatever your sexual identity is neutral. All right. Start your free trial at applicantlab.com. Yeah, I think some of the things that I talked about are actually part of in the free trial for the to-do list. Sorry if I didn't get to your questions. It was so funny. I was like, oh man, we're not going to have, I had like some PowerPoint slides ready to go. I was like, it's just going to be like a ghost town, tumbleweeds, silence. So I was like, well, let me put some slides together in case I don't have any questions. And we ended up having like a ton of questions. So sorry if I didn't get to your question. But yeah, check out Applicant Lab, and thank you to GMAT Club as always for hosting me. Please like below wherever it is. It's always, I never know where it is. It's down here somewhere. Just like it. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone, and best wishes for the next 4 weeks. You can do it. Bye.